Justice sometimes comes in the form of a dark friend we need, serving up misery and pain on its own time, with the punishment fittingly not always equal to the deed, but to the pain that was inflicted. That's what 17-year-old Ethan Andersen and Connor Saxton heard a man uttering as they stepped inside what looked to be an old, abandoned house in Crescent Valley, Nevada on July 21st, 2009. It made them stop, giving each other concerned looks as they turned to run when the man said, "Well, if you're gonna come in, then get the hell in here, why don't you?" Earlier that day, they'd been out plinking their 22s in the desert when they saw the house in the distance and decided to check it out. As they walked further inside, they found an old man confined to a wheelchair, who then told them some dark and terrifying details of his life. Connor had been recording everything on his phone and left it running as the old man told his story. This is a transcription of the recording. "Get your asses over here. I'd ask what the hell you're doing here, but it doesn't matter. Sit down, boys. You're about to hear something no one else has before. Whether you believe me or not doesn't matter, as I don't have much time left on this earth. Our entire lives we're led to believe certain things. Some true, most not. We're taught hate is wrong, that it'll hold us back. Hate can be a catalyst, the fuel needed to administer justice to those who deserve it when karma fails to deliver. Unfortunately, though, sometimes the innocent get caught in its wake. For far too long, people have gotten away with heinous acts that affected those around them their entire lives, with little to no consequences. Only the good die young seems to be more true than not. Well, I was able to conjure something from the darkest corners of hell. I was 13 when my mother mysteriously left one night, leaving my father and 3 siblings gutted and devastated. That night, the seeds of hate were planted inside me. My father was never himself after that. He hung on as long as he could, but a year later I came home from school to find he'd put his Colt .45 revolver in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The wall behind him was painted with his blood and pieces of brain and skull. I fell to my knees as I picked up a note next to him my mother had left the night she disappeared. As I read it, I tried keeping it together as I fought back the tears. She'd been having an affair with the man for a while and decided to run away with him and start a new family. Instantly, it felt like something entered my body. It was hate like I'd never felt before. I then lost consciousness and woke up sometime later to my little sister screeching as she entered my father's room. When I sat up and looked at her, I noticed a small dark spot in my vision that wasn't there before, in the corner of my left eye. I rubbed my eye thinking it was just something stuck in there, but it wouldn't go away. One of my other siblings must have called the police as I sat there next to my father's deceased body, holding his hand, knowing it'd be the last time to do so. My father was a good man who worked hard and loved us, including my mother, more than life itself. It was heartbreak that made him put that Colt in his mouth and pulled the trigger. I still can't fathom the pain he must have gone through during that last year of his life. When the police entered the room, they lifted me up and moved me into the living room, where they began questioning me. I tuned them out as I silently repeated to myself over and over, "Burn in hell, bitch. Burn in hell, bitch," as I pictured my mother's face. Not long after, it was decided we'd be split up, with me and my youngest sister going to live with my father's little brother and his family on their farm in Salem, Oregon. My 2 other siblings going to Northern California to live with my father's oldest sister. I hadn't seen them since I was about 8 years old and didn't know what to expect. My father always spoke highly of his brother, so that helped some, knowing my sister would be all right. As for me, I didn't give 2 shits about anything at that point. I felt nothing but rage and could care less what happened to me. The only feeling I had was revulsion from my mother and what she did to us. I envisioned running into her, looking into her eyes, and strangling her until she took her last breath. After arriving at my uncle's place, and for the better part of a year, I kept to myself, not saying much. I did what I was told and went about doing my own thing as the hate grew stronger each day, as did the dark spot in my eye, which had now begun to take shape. One day during the summer, I was out checking the irrigation on one of the far fields of hay when I heard laughing. I looked over to see 3 jocks I recognized from my school chasing another boy across the field. I watched as they caught up and knocked him down with the big branch one of them was carrying. They began beating and kicking him as he pleaded with them to stop. I dropped what I was doing, about to run to help him, when the face of my mother flashed through my mind and rage surged through me. The dark spot quickly took the shape of a hand with pointed fingers, then suddenly vanished from my eye. I rubbed my eye, thinking I was imagining things, when I heard one of the jocks yell out, "What is that? Do you see that?" I looked just in time to see the hand gripping one of them by the neck as I heard what sounded like a piece of wood being snapped. He dropped to the ground in a heap as the hand went to the next jock, snapping his neck as well, and then the last one. The boy sat there in utter disbelief, watching as they each fell to the ground. He looked back at me with a look of terror I can still see to this day as a hand grabbed him by the neck, lifted him into the air, snapping his neck as well. I gasped loudly as I watched his body hit the ground. Within seconds, the dark hand was back in my eye. A million thoughts went through my mind as the hot summer sun cooked my skin. I knew I should be feeling something, but felt nothing but pain and hate. Surely no one will believe the truth, and I'll most likely get blamed somehow, as everybody already considers me to be the strange kid, I uttered to myself. People didn't think or care, but I noticed them whispering every time I entered a room or walked by. I knew right then I needed to run far away from there. It pained me knowing I'd be leaving my little sister alone, but whatever my hate had conjured up could not be trusted after what had just happened. That night, while everyone slept, I quietly gathered what few belongings I had, kissed my little sister on the cheek, and snuck out through the bathroom window. I had no plans other than heading south where it'd be warmer when winter hit. I walked for hours along that dark, empty highway before someone picked me up, giving me a ride all the way to the California border. I then walked some distance before coming to an empty, worn down house on the side of the highway and decided to spend the night there. After eating some corn and potatoes I'd taken from a field along the way, I stared at the ceiling before finally drifting off to sleep. Sometime later, I had a dream someone covered my face with a black mask, and I couldn't breathe. I woke up with my arms and legs flailing as I struggled for air. When I opened my eyes, I could see the dark hand above my face and realized it had been the thing stopping me from breathing. The hand quickly vanished, going back into my eye. I sat up in a panic, touching my throat, which hurt like hell. I gazed at the stars through the broken window in front of me as I uttered quietly, "Why is it turning on me? What sort of evil have I unleashed?" Before falling back asleep, I remembered how I found my father, with the back of his head gone. Murderous thoughts of my mother filled my mind as I smirked. Over the next several days, I hitched my way down to Boulder City, Nevada, where I ended up working as a cook at a local diner. I remember a few days after I'd started, I overheard my coworkers talking about some high school boys that were found dead in a hayfield in Oregon with their necks broken. The police had no suspects, but were looking for someone who was big enough to be capable of doing such a thing to four decent-sized young men at the same time. Of course, it was never solved and later written off as a freak accident. As time passed, it seemed the hate inside me grew, as did the dark spot in my eye. Every night, I dreamt my face was covered with a black mask. I'd wake up gasping for air as I saw the black hand quickly vanish above me. Over time, the dark spot began taking form of something terrifying and indescribable. It seemed to be taking on a life of its own. Not a day went by, though, where the thought of putting a bullet between my mother's eyes didn't cross my mind. I would close my eyes and imagine I just found my father's body. I'd then reach down, pick up his Colt 45, walk outside to find my mother standing on our porch. I raise the pistol, putting it between her eyes, and squeeze the trigger as I smile. While working at the diner, I kept mostly to myself, never talking about my past, and when someone did ask me questions about who I was, I lied. Several years went by with no incidents. Then late one night, I just finished my shift as I stepped out the back door to find a couple arguing under a lamppost next to their car. I put my head down and turned to walk towards my place when I heard the man slap the woman, sending her to the ground. This made me stop and look. "What are you staring at, asshole?" said the man angrily as he glared at me. I quickly looked for the dark spot but noticed it was gone as I watched the man being lifted into the air, turned upside down, and slammed against a utility pole. I could see and hear the bones in his body being snapped as he screamed out in agony. By this time, the woman had gained her composure and was going hysterical. The man was then dropped to the ground with a loud thud. The woman tried running, but was quickly picked up and carried off into the darkness. I felt nothing as I looked around, making sure no one saw what had just happened, then calmly walked home and went to bed. When I awoke the next day, the dark spot was back in my eye, and it had grown substantially. As I laid there in bed, I heard a knock at my door. I had an idea who it was, and I was right. It was the local deputies. I stood in the doorway, not letting them in, as they showed me pictures of the couple, asking if I had seen anything after leaving the diner, to which, of course, I said no. I could tell one of them believed me, but the other kept staring at me like he knew I was lying, and there was something off about me. Before leaving, the deputy who was suspicious of me asked me several questions about my past, to which, of course, I again lied. He even asked for identification, which I hadn't gotten yet and never planned on getting if I could avoid it. As I watched them get into their car, I decided, like before, it was time to move on. I packed my things that day and hitched a ride to Battle Mountain, which I'd guess is where you boys are from. It didn't take long before I found work in the local mines, and there I worked for many years. As I grew older, I figured out how to keep my hate under control, which stopped the dark spot from coming out. It was always there, though, never leaving. One night in September of 1971, I was in a local bar drinking with some of the other guys from the mines. We'd been there for a while and had drank a lot. As I took a swig and set my beer down, I had a flashback of my father laying on the floor the way I'd found him. Not long after, I saw my mother's face, which sent me into a rage. I immediately jumped up from my chair and quickly left the bar for fear it would make an appearance. It was raining something awful that night as I walked along the highway, not knowing where I was headed. I just knew I needed to get away from people. I couldn't get my mother's face out of my mind. I hadn't felt such hate for a very long time, years in fact. I walked for several hours without seeing a single soul or even a car before I came to the top of a small hill along the highway. There was a pause in the rain, and the clouds cleared, which left the stars giving enough light to see for a distance. As I looked down the hill, I noticed a station wagon parked in the rest area. I figured there were people in it, which I was trying to avoid, so I turned to head back home when I saw the dark flash and knew it was unleashed. I fell to my knees as a man had gotten out of the car and was checking under the hood like something was wrong. I then watched him get slammed against the car and dragged across the ground. He managed to get up, run to the car, and yell something before being picked up and disappearing into the darkness. A minute later, the car's door was ripped off as people scrambled out and started running up the hill in front of them. It looked to me like 4 kids and their mother. I could do nothing but watch as the mother and what looked to be the oldest son get picked up and carried off one by one. It started raining again as the 3 remaining kids started going down the highway in the opposite direction. I thought about running to warn them, but knew there was nothing I could do once it was out. A few minutes later, I stood up and made the long walk back home. The following morning, the dark spot was back in my eye. Later that day, I went to the supermarket and could see a crowd of people huddled around multiple law enforcement vehicles. I, of course, knew why. I stopped to listen and overheard them saying a family of 6 was attacked along the highway last night, and there was only one survivor. After going home, I did nothing but stare into the abyss, pondering what to do. I knew running wouldn't solve anything, and no one had any clue I was involved. I had only a few more years left in the mines before I planned on moving to Crescent Valley, where I would be by myself, away from everyone. Several years later, I did just that, and everything was fine until June 7th, 1985. Every 2 weeks, I'd make the drive into Battle Mountain for groceries and supplies, and I'd go at night to avoid people. That night after getting groceries, I had to stop for gas. As I stood there looking up at the stars, filling up my car, an older couple pulled up next to me. The man got out, started pumping gas, then went inside. Soon after, the woman got out to stretch. It was several seconds before she turned to look at me. As she looked into my eyes, it was like getting kicked in the stomach. I knew without a doubt it was my mother. She saw me glaring at her, then she got this bewildered look on her face. Hate, far worse than anything I'd ever experienced, seemed to pierce my soul. She was about to say something when I knew what was going to happen next. I saw the dart flash and watched as she was lifted high into the air. Her arms and legs were stretched out like they were going to be ripped off. She was then slowly crumpled into a large ball as I heard every bone in her body snap and crunch. I smiled at her as she looked down at me, crying out my name for help, shrieking in unimaginable pain. When she fell to the ground in a heap, I calmly got in my car and drove home. That night, I had the best sleep I'd had in years. As I opened my eyes that morning, something happened I wasn't expecting. The dark spot was gone. It made sense. Justice was finally served. My father could finally rest in peace. Like you probably heard me say when you first came here, justice sometimes comes in the form of a dark friend we need, serving up misery and pain on its own time, with the punishment fittingly not always equal to the deed, but to the pain that was inflicted. You boys best run along now. Ethan and Connor kept the story to themselves for a few years, but did some digging and verified the killings and disappearances had taken place just like the old man said. The brutal death of the old man's mother was concluded by police that she'd gotten in a hit and run by a semi-truck. Every bone in her body had in fact been broken. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.